I've been following this since 2015, and why have I been following it since 2015? I'm a political risk underwriter, so I get some sort of geeky pleasure about watching countries fail, succeed, watching politics go wrong in countries, and providing insurance to people who have financial interests in them not going wrong, whether that's investment contracts, whether it's export contracts, whether it's trade, pre-export finance, whatever it might be. And I've been doing that for 40 years, first as a broker and since '96 as an underwriter. So I was fascinated when I saw the first stories about Liberland. And it intrigued me because of where it is. And most countries that happen like this, and there aren't that many examples, are landlocked. There's one in Africa. They've got no basis of existing because unless they are ingratiated with the country that surrounds them. They're not on a massive river as Liberland is on the Danube. There's so much that Liberland is different for that made this really interesting. So I've learnt from contracts going wrong, which I've insured, which I've had to pay claims on, and it just intrigued me to see how this might develop. So in all things that start new, a country like Liberland has some interesting hurdles. And the concept of providing political risk insurance and credit insurance to entities trading with Liberland, a country like Liberland, in and of itself, is not new. The challenge here is that it's so new, there aren't many people that recognize it as a country, and it slightly makes that concept of what sort of insurance we can provide more difficult. But as I'll take you through this, and I won't be too long, I would just add that part of what we offer is credit insurance, which is neither credit nor insurance. It's really providing a backstop if you don't get paid by a foreign party, and that's part of what this does. So, this is the areas I'm going to talk about. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about each of them, and the stuff is all there. But let me start with why do we want insurance in the first place? Without a modern state can't really function without insurance, and that's largely because most modern states and even old states don't have enough money to compensate for big natural disasters, for big crises. It would absolutely, if you look at the US and imagine that there was no insurance that covers against hurricanes and natural disasters, it couldn't function. And even though you've had, as an example of that, you've had quite a few incoming presidents of the US swearing that they will get rid of Bermuda because it robs the Treasury, US Treasury, of tax. They know very well that once they get there, if they do that, they're also robbing it of the ability to insure itself against major catastrophes, because that can only be done in an environment where there isn't an additional tax cost on top of it. And Bermuda and other offshore tax-efficient venues provide that. So you can't run a modern state unless you have something that covers the potential of a big loss through a natural disaster or any man-made disaster. And any country is at risk of that. It burdens the state heavily if it has to compensate. So you can't really do without insurance. And if you look at a state like Liberland, or perhaps older states, in their formative years, if there's a massive loss which causes them to fall over, it hugely damages investor confidence. It wipes out people who are already there, and it leaves them with not a lot of hope, and makes them vulnerable to actions by the neighbors who think, I've got to clear up this problem because there's a financial hole on my doorstep and it's out of control. So it's vital that a country has a financial system and an insurance system that enables it to provide a stable financial existence. In Liberland's case, any move to assist it in becoming financially stable will also consolidate its statehood and its right to statehood, and I'll talk a bit more about that as well. So in the first instance, what sort of insurances? Well, most of you will be familiar with many of these. You obviously want to be able to insure buildings. The state may have some buildings that it also wants to insure, because absent insuring those, if they fall over, it has to rebuild them, and that costs money which may not be readily available. Insurers are quite used to paying out those sort of funds. So property is obvious. Casualty and liability, that's going to become more relevant as contractors come and work in Liberland and either get something wrong and cause some damage, or somebody else does something wrong to them and they need to be compensated. None of that the state can easily pay for, whereas an established insurance industry can. And then clearly there are things like accident and health, life and pensions. And I suppose when I looked at Lieberland first in 2015, and I came to this region first well, not quite this region, a bit further south. I was in Bosnia-Herzegovina in 2007, 2 years after the war finished, working with the World Bank to try to put a scheme in place that would re-encourage trade and investment into Bosnia-Herzegovina. And I mean, don't want to spend too much time. It's just an interesting story. I went down with a lawyer friend of mine. We were working with the World Bank. We met various government officials from the 3 states that make up the 3 governments that made up Bosnia-Herzegovina. And we wanted to drive up to Banja Luka. So we agreed before we left that we'd hire a car, which I did from Sarajevo. And then we realized we weren't going to have time. So I canceled the car hire. And then we realized we were going to have time. So I tried to reinstate it. So I rang the hire company and said, that car I cancelled, can I have it? And they said, where are you going? And I said, well, around Sarajevo, but also up to Banja Luka. They put the phone down. I thought, maybe a bad connection, I'll try that again. And got the phone put down on me again. How naive was I as a political risk underwriter? Anyway, I rang the British Embassy and said, what's that all about? And they laughed and said, well, if you go up north with a car with Sarajevan plates, doesn't matter what nationality you are, they're going to rip the car apart and probably put you in prison and beat you up. So that's not a good idea. And I said, well, then he up there is looking after me because that's what we were going to do. And I would have done if we hadn't cancelled it. So I said, well, what to do? I still want to go up there. And he said, well, there's not all is lost. We have somebody here in the embassy who's ex-army who has a fleet of cream-coloured Land Rovers with English plates on them, but no nationality. And the steering wheel's on the wrong side. That's not going to be a problem. You're not going to get bothered with those because no one recognizes them and they think they're UN vehicles. So that's what we did. And we drove up and it was pretty horrendous. There was not much on the road. There were buildings that you could still see bullet holes and windows blown out and there. It was pretty depressing to see. But I wanted to see it because I wanted to see whether I could back this through commercial insurance. And it persuaded me that it could be done. And so that was my first sort of exposure to this region. And we put the scheme together. It worked very well. It encouraged reinvestment, and it played to the strengths of the multilaterals, of the Bretton Woods institutions, and the private sector, because it worked to the strength of both of those. That led to me doing a similar thing for a multilateral when I was based in Kenya for Africa. Exactly the same concept, but for a whole range of countries. So we were a diplomatic mission. I was founding chief executive of that. We had ties to, at that point, 10 or 12 countries and other private sector entities that were putting money in. And that was, again, an example of the state working together, or states working together with the private sector. So for all that, you need some of these covers, and you need to deal with the big risks that could derail your project. So those are some of the things you might look at first. But really, in the first instance, what does Lieberland need to look at first? And I think I would pick political risk. I've got my own definition of political risk, which I'm not going to read because it's too long, but I could never find one, so I wrote my own some years ago. And it's pretty broad, but it is basically anything that can derail an investment or derail a trade contract between parties that is something that is either sponsored or not stopped by a state. There's plenty of examples of that going on in Lieberland only just this morning. And we need to try and find a solution to that, which is normally not much of an issue, except in this case, we have a state that is a parastate because it's not really recognized by enough countries. And it doesn't yet fully, although we heard earlier on how that will change, it doesn't yet fully have a constitution, it doesn't yet have a legal system, and we'll come back to those points. But I am in the process of looking at a solution, working with the company that I'm now with, to find some political risk insurance, to work some political risk insurance. And why do we want to do that? We want to do that because what we actually need to have is some small losses. And we heard previous speakers talk about actions against the Croatian government. Tom was talking about it. What we need that's even stronger than that is losses that insurers have paid, where they're then suing the Croatian government and saying, you didn't stop that happening. These guys were wearing army uniforms, border uniforms, forestry uniforms. They were employees of the state. They walked into a region that isn't theirs, and they stole stuff. Now, normally you'd call that theft, but when a government does it, you call it confiscation. And that's what you're covering against in a political risk policy. Now, that'll cost a few claims. You then take that to court and you sue the government for not preventing it. That gets pretty embarrassing. And it might happen a couple of times before they realize we can't do this anymore. It's just embarrassing. It doesn't matter who it is that we're doing it from. We're a civilized nation that believes in international law, and we're allowing our people in uniform to steal something from another region that we don't run. And that's what I hope to achieve by this process. And I think that what it does is reinforces statehood, it reinforces the independence of the region, and it will create a very strong case for the creations to stop doing it. But to do that, I'm sorry about the complication of this slide, to do that, we do need to think about Liberland investing in a basic insurance structure. And I've been having brief chats with Vid about this, but you probably need to begin by having a state-owned insurance company, which you can later privatize. The reason you might want to do that as state-owned, and the reason why you don't want to have everybody come in, is because you want to be able to govern what insurance is sold in Liberland. It can be commercially done, it can have plenty of competition, but you want a level playing field of insurance that you want to have sold in the country, that it has to be a certain quality of cover, it has to be on a certain approved basis, so that there are, in the end, you want to develop the economy of Liberland. We're not interested in developing the economy of Germany, because that's where some big reinsurers sit, or Switzerland, or anywhere else. We want to be able to create a lively finance and insurance market in Liberland. And the only way you can do that is to pass a law that says primary insurance has to go through the state-owned company to begin with. And you can then create competitive companies to do that. But that means that premiums stay in the country, that you have a competitive environment, and you are able to govern what those policies say and what the law says. And it's also pretty easy to arrange. This is common stuff. And it's also, I think almost without exception, every country, no country will allow a foreign insurer to come in, and somebody's going to find an exception if there is one, there may be one, to let a primary insurer come in and just offer a policy to anybody in that state without doing it through a branch that is registered in that country. And that is because they want to regulate insurance that is sold to citizens. Because if that doesn't work, it's the state ultimately that's going to have to pay out and compensate, which the state doesn't want to do. That's the whole point of insurance. And then you buy reinsurance. Now, you don't need much capital, because the reinsurers know that as they see Liberland and other countries like Liberland, that aren't perhaps like Liberland, but younger countries and even older countries develop, they're going to see that they need to have, they want to be in there, they want to offer cover, and the only way in is to offer it as a reinsurance to the state company. So you have control in the state as to what passes through. And so we talked about law in the earlier thing here. So the easiest way to do it is to do what Singapore did. You adopt English insurance law, mutatis mutandis, which is what Singapore has done, and then LIRC, which I've named the state company, then buys reinsurance externally to cover the exposures that it otherwise has on its books. You have a dispute resolution procedure, which can either be along the lines of an international arbitration panel, we talked a bit about that in the earlier conversation, or it can be an ad hoc panel of judges that meet remotely, blockchain-based, but can decide cases pretty quickly, and they decide them under Liberland law. And you don't need much capital to do it. So what are the immediate demands? Well, I think these are the immediate demands for the country. And I think they are largely to do with political risk, to create a more stable environment for people to work and live in Liberland without incursions. And I think that to achieve that, I think we need to have some losses, and we need to have some court cases that insurers will take, not necessarily taken by individuals who've had losses, but either jointly the insurers and those who've had losses, or the insurers backing the people who've had losses, so that it becomes a much more public matter for those cases to be taken to international courts. But it's crucial that Liberland has a law in place that dictates what it says insurance should be for its interests. Because you don't want to be the political victim of a foreign state's laws, which may be politically influenced if they're not in the interest. Let's just give an example. If it was English law and English courts could decide on a loss that happened in Lieberland, I realize I'm getting a bit technical here, but it is important, then it may be that the English courts don't really want this particular case to win in favor of Lieberland because they have a political interest in supporting Croatia, Serbia, whatever it might be. So it's important that the law is Lieberland law and that the courts that decide on that case have no option but to use Lieberland law in deciding whether or not it's a valid claim. So you need that, and the entity needs to be Lieberland too. And that's it. Anybody got any questions? I'd love to hear them.